Well, joining us today, we have athletic writers Mark Critchley and Dan Sheldon. Dan, thanks very much for being here. I'm going to start with you. Just give us the details, first of all, of Erik Ten Hag's new contract.
So the top line is it's been extended to 2026, which it was initially due to expire next year in 2025. There was some initial confusion as to whether he had signed a new contract or whether the club had just triggered the option of the additional 12 months, which is something they had the right to do. We then got clarity on that no, it's just a case they have just triggered that. So it's not a case of him signing a new contract per se. The club have just exercised an option they already had in his deal. Now, what that means is the terms of his contract remain the same. So he's on the same salary. He has the same rights as he had before, which I think importantly for him is that he has a veto on transfers. So effectively, if they present a player to him and he doesn't want to sign that player, he can say no. So yeah, it's pretty much the status quo continuing is how I would say in terms of his role, his job title, what he's allowed to do when it comes to transfers. It's not quite the fancy new deal that perhaps many people thought it could be. But nonetheless, it is a backing of some sorts, but perhaps not just as strong as it could have been.
A backing of some sorts. That's particularly underwhelming way of putting it. Mark, from your perspective, this comes just weeks after they were considering replacing him. Do you get the feeling that this is a genuine sign of faith or just simply a logistical process that they've gone through?
I don't think it's a resounding show of faith. Look, it's exactly what Dan says. It's the status quo extended for another year. It's essentially what has been on the table for the whole time since INEOS walked through the door, since Ten Hag became manager. So it's not the resounding show of faith that perhaps we maybe expected. But then, did we really expect it? I think is the question, because look, when that FA Cup final kicked off, I think we would all have been surprised at that point if Ten Hag would have been the manager at the start of this coming season, never mind have his stay extended until the end of next season, right? So from that perspective, I think it's just about as good a deal as Ten Hag could really have got. And I get it, but look, would a new contract really have been a wise decision? This is still a manager who was responsible, all the caveats about injuries and whatever, and the uncertainty around the club and the takeover, etc. This is still a manager who was responsible for United finishing in the lowest Premier League finish of the Premier League era, right? So I think a new contract that would have, sort of reaffirmed the commitment maybe would have been perhaps a step too far and not really reflective of the season that United have just gone through. But what we have instead is Ten Hag working on the same terms within a new structure, having the chance to work within that new structure, which is and to be able to be judged on that. And yeah, I think there is also a show of faith in some ways as well, right? Like Dan's mentioned, he's still got his transfer veto. He is still the manager rather than a head coach. Those are two things that INEOS wouldn't been totally keen on, right? It's not the ideal way that they usually set up their clubs. And he's also had a say over some of the changes that we expect to be made at coaching level as well. So there is some, trust and some faith in there. But I think it's just about as much as Ten Hag could realistically expect given the results last season.
We'll get stuck into the transfer veto and how decisions are going to be made in a moment's time. But Dan, let me just come back to you. In terms of a potential hangover, having been speaking to every manager under the sun as a potential replacement for Erik Ten Hag, I guess we're just not going to know whether the Manchester United players are going to be buying into Erik Ten Hag once again until the season gets going. So, I mean, this could be seen as a risky strategy from INEOS, considering all the other background work that they're doing.
Absolutely. I think if Manchester United have a poor start to the season and they get to kind of September, October, November, and they're struggling for wins and they're looking out of form again, you will absolutely have a section of fans sort of saying, well, hang on a minute. Why we knew this was going to happen. All you had to do was look at last season, and they may view it as Erik's been given a stay of execution. the alternative, obviously, Erik, you would imagine, is going to come in confident. He's already spoken about the fact that United have spoken to other candidates. I think when he was appearing as a pundit on Dutch TV for England's game against Serbia at the Euros, I think he kind of said that United disturbed his holiday to tell him that he's keeping his job, and that they decided that, yes, we have spoken to Thomas Tuchel, but we think you're better than him. Which is, yeah, I mean, fair play to him for getting his side out there. But I think fundamentally, I don't know if Critch would agree or not, if there will be a lot of pressure to start the season fast, I think, for Erik, because, he has been given this extension of some backing of sorts. If they're back to square one, struggling again, losing games, not playing well at all, there will be questions asked of INEOS, I think. Well, hang on a minute. Everyone thought you were going to sack him. They won the FA Cup final. You spoke to every manager under the sun, ended up sticking with Ten Hag, and now you're going to have to sack him anyway. And the season, we're 3-4 months into the season, so then you just write that season off. So yeah, I think it's in a really interesting time.
Rich, did you want to jump in on that?
No, I think Dan's right. I think that is the gamble that INEOS have kind of half taken here in ultimately going through this whole process, like talking to a lot of managers and then falling on Ten Hag and deciding to stick with the guy that they had in place anyway. This is the single biggest decision that they've had to make since they took charge in the last 6 months. It's one that they have to get right. And by extending this deal, it's not only going to be questioned from a sporting perspective if it goes wrong at the start of the season, where if results turn, it's going to be questioned from a financial perspective as well, because, Ten Hag's payout is going to be an extra year on top of what it otherwise might have been. The club at the moment is under pressure financially. You only need to see the things that are happening off the field in terms of cutbacks and a limited budget, more limited than we're used to in the transfer market. I think when they dismissed Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, when they dismissed Jose Mourinho, the payouts that they had to make were significant, totaling something like 40 million combined for those two. Ralf Rangnick as well, actually. This is not really a time where United as a club can really afford to be chopping and changing managers, and actually can't really afford to take risks on managers either. And that is something that you have to admit they sort of have done here with Ten Hag, because last season's results weren't totally convincing. It even felt like INEOS weren't totally convinced by him for a lot of the culmination of the season. And so moving into a new campaign and moving forward with him is undoubtedly a risk. I think this is going to be a huge test and a huge challenge of INEOS's judgment. But it's one that they've kind of been forced to stick to and that they're going with now. And we've got to see, results will ultimately dictate to how that's viewed. Yeah.
I always remember, when I covered Southampton, at the end of the 21-22 season, the board there were seriously discussing getting rid of Ralph Hasenhüttl, who, performance had fallen off a cliff. The players were no longer kind of that cliche playing for him. But because there was the World Cup in December, there was obviously that big break. And they were saying, well, if we just sack him then. They'd already basically made their mind up that if they started badly, they would sack him then. By that point, Southampton were, I think, bottom of the table. They sacked him and they ended up getting relegated. And obviously Man United won't ever be in that position where they're going to get relegated. But it just shows the kind of muddled thinking that sometimes you think, and Southampton changed all of Hasenhüttl's back from staff as well. They basically thought, well, we'll change everything to try and make you successful, and it just didn't quite work out for Ralph again. Whether that repeats itself at Old Trafford or not, I'm not sure, but I think it's an interesting kind of, you have seen that before where clubs do stick with a manager hoping that it'll turn around and then quickly realise, the players are still the same and they're still not playing for him.
That said, it was interesting just a couple of days after he was officially appointed the sporting director of Manchester United, after the long process with Newcastle was finally concluded, that Dan Ashworth was quoted on that New Deal release. And, excuse me, if he wanted to sound a little bit more like middle management, when he said, we reached the conclusion that Erik was the best partner for us to work with in driving up standards and outcomes. That was his words. in the press release. How involved was he in this process, considering he wasn't the Manchester United sporting director, Mark?
Well, I think it was interesting that he was quoted in the release. I agree, and some of the language in there, I think, was totally reflective of discussions and conversations that INEOS had been having all the way through the process, which I'm sure he would have been across conversations that were being had from the moment that he was basically placed on that gardening leave in February. That's probably true of Omar Barada as well. He was, of course, had the same situation before he comes in as the incoming chief executive at City. But I think what's more important than any one figure in this is that INEOS, his approach to this decision, which again, like I say, was the biggest decision that they've had to make over these past 6 months, has been more sort of collaborative and collective, and really kind of at the same time funneled up towards the ultimate decision maker, which is Jim Ratcliffe. You know, I think as much when you pay as much like 1.3 or 4 billion pounds for a club, you don't have the structure and the hierarchy in place immediately, which has been the case for INEOS over these past few months, then ultimately a lot of decisions are gonna land a bit further up the food chain as well. But no, it has been sort of collective and collaborative. I have a deal of sympathy for INEOS in that, you know, their deal was only struck, if you remember, on Christmas Eve. They were only really got their feet under the table in February. They've wanted Ashworth in, they wanted Barada in. Ashworth's now there. Barada starts, I think, next Saturday is his official starting day. At the time when that decision needed to be made about Ten Hag, there was only really Jason Wilcox from Southampton as the technical director through the door in terms of the most senior hires that they wanted to make. So I think, you know, perhaps if that structure had been in place a bit earlier, perhaps if there hadn't been the complications over Ashworth, then maybe we'd have arrived at a decision quicker and cleaner, and maybe the process wouldn't have been stretched out as much as it was. But in the end, you know, they had to sort of muddle through, and I think that was a deal of sympathy for them in regards to that, because it's just been such a hectic 6 months, basically, you know, trying to cram all this in and have these huge decisions to make and essentially turn a tanker around in the form of Manchester United and try and set it on the right path. I think from now on, you know, you can expect more of that sort of middle management speak, absolutely, but you can expect a slightly more streamlined process and hopefully a bit more of a cleaner process, because I think most people would agree that those 2.5 weeks after the FA Cup final it was quite a long time to wait for a decision, which ultimately we now know they could really have just taken just by triggering a clause in Ten Hag's existing contract. It didn't really need to last this long. So I'd expect a bit more of a streamlined decision making process going forward now that Ashworth is through the door.
Well, let's get into this new structure then. We've touched upon Dan Ashworth, who is he's the sporting director. Dan, just take us through this hierarchy, how it's set up, who's feeding into who's reporting into who, in a succinct understanding of how this new era is going to work for me, please.
So I think if you start at the top, you've got Omar Barada coming in as the CEO, so he will start on July the 13th. They appointed him in January. I think David Ornstein broke the story in The Athletic. So he sits at the top of that tree. You then have Dan Ashworth coming in as a sporting director, start on July the 1st. He reports into Omar. Now, United say Ashworth's job is to essentially lead on all the football operations and all the football departments. So that includes the men's team, the women's team, the academy, including all kind of the technical performance and operational areas as well. So you have Omar, then you have Dan. Then you'll have Jason Wilcox, who started as technical director in April. He reports into Dan. Now, his role is to work in partnership with the men's first team manager and coaching staff. And it'll be Jason's job to implement a clear game model and football methodology across the men's first team and academy. And he will lead on all men's team player recruitment. And then if you want to go into it, they've obviously just appointed Christopher Vivell on a short-term basis as the director of global talent. It was his first day yesterday. Now he's come in to help with the transfer window. His job will be to recommend the best available talent for the men's first team. And and will also kind of be tasked with identifying emerging talent, as the club call it, which is essentially players they can put into their development program. So that's kind of a breakdown of who they've appointed and what they're going to be doing.
Critch, I'm just going to play devil's advocate on this, that you've got a lot of people experienced and by all accounts very good at their job, but you've got a lot of people who are now going to want to make their presence felt. I suppose that the key in this is that everyone is on the same page and everyone is streamlined. Do you feel that has been key in INEOS's setup to get the right people in the right positions, or are you still a little bit uncertain as to how all of this is going to fit together?
I think there has to be an element of uncertainty just because we've been speaking for years about the need for Manchester United to have this sort of structure. And to be honest, it's not anything that's totally new, right? At United, I know we've spoke about this, right? People have been demanding a structure. Actually, if you think back a few years ago, 2021, that was the first time that United tried to and attempted to put this kind of structure in place. When John Mert was appointed football director, you had Darren Fletcher in as technical director. This is what fans, journalists, media have been crying out for a long time. And speaking to people around the club years since, or people who've worked within the club under that kind of regime and that structure, they look at what INEOS are trying to do, and what they see is something that's not a million miles away of what was actually attempted with Murta and with Fletcher in those positions. The difference that INEOS need to make with this structure is basically that it actually works, that the people within it have the courage and have the authority to be able to make decisions, take decisions, to be able to have debates. You say about everybody singing from the same hymn sheet and being on the same page, right? I think what's also important is that people feel able to challenge each other on things, and if they believe something's going wrong, to raise their hand and say so. I think that's how these kind of organisations and these structures operate best, is when it's all not just all funneled into one guy and he's got a load of yes men around him, we're all nodding their heads. And I think that has sometimes been a bit of an issue with United in the past, where particularly when it comes to perhaps saying no to a manager. I think that has sometimes been an issue in the past, and that is one thing that I think INEOS really need to focus on and concentrate on, because that is the way to ensuring that this structure works. Now, look, if you look at INEOS's track record within football, it's mixed, I think you'd say at best, but the reputation of the people that they've essentially headhunted and brought in is among the best in the business, right? Omar Barada was a huge coup to take from City, and many people at City believed that he would eventually take over from Ferran Soriano, their current chief executive, one day. Dan Ashworth, nobody needs me to go through his reputation, right? And England DNA and et cetera, and just the fact that he's been at 3 Premier League clubs over the last 2 or 3 years, and they're all paying multiples of millions of pounds in order to get this guy in to build their football operation. These people are the best in class that we keep hearing about, that INEOS want to appoint. So I think you'd have a lot of faith in them from that perspective, but you're right, it's about how it all gels together. And perhaps INEOS's track record at other football clubs doesn't suggest that, it's always a seamless process, but actually I think the reputations of the individuals that have been appointed are a reason for hope for United fans, yeah.
Just to add on to that, sorry, Adam, I think Matt Slater, our senior football news reporter at the Athletic, I'm sure I've heard him on this podcast before, talking to Critch's point there about, I think Sir Jim and Sir Dave will concede they don't know everything about football, but what they will do is they will try and appoint the best people, or the most high profile with a really good track record, and that's what they're doing at United now. And just as Critch says, it's whether all of that gels together and can work. I'm sure they're hoping it will. I'm sure it probably will too. But yeah, they will, as Matt would say, they would admit they're not well versed in football. I'm sure they know quite a bit about it now, but they're quite happy to appoint who they would see as best in class.
But do you think that having seen them in the stands in the build up to getting this new structure in place, we're going to see Sir Jim Radcliffe, we're going to see Sir Dave Brailsford in the director's box with that sort of presence to almost just be showing, well, no, we are also taking an interest as well as Barada, Ashworth, Wilcox, Vivell.
Yeah, I think, well, Ratcliffe obviously lives in Monaco, so he can only spend so much time in the UK anyway. So, I mean, he will have to be more selective with the days he does come over. He was at a few games last year. I think you'd probably see more of Brailsford. I think he's more visible around the training ground as well, but obviously he's busy with all of the other stuff going on at INEOS at the moment. You've got the Tour de France and all the other projects they've got. So yeah, I mean, how often will you see them? I'm not sure, but I think the message they're sending is that this is their team, right? That this is the team that they've created. These are the people we think can help change this club's fortunes around, and we trust them implicitly. I think that's the message they're sending.
And Critch, that means there's no excuses, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I think this is really the start of the INEOS era proper. Okay, so once you get your top execs through the door, once you make those appointments and those hires, and once you essentially build the structure that you promised and that you've pinned a lot of United's problems on, right? Let's get that right. That's been, whenever Ratcliffe was asked about Ten Hag's future, whenever he was asked about the question of the manager over the past 6 months, ever since the deal was announced, he's always been very keen to move it away from the conversation around Ten Hag and sort of pin it on the years of decline under the Glazers' ownership without ever naming the Glazers. There's actually a clause in the SEC file in the big agreement that they said they're not allowed to say bad things about each other, essentially. And I sometimes Ratcliffe's kind of strayed the boundaries of that clause, I think, and it's got a little bit tasty and a little bit interesting. Essentially, he's always said the reason that United aren't performing is because of a sort of kind of a neglect, I guess is the word. It's not the word he used, but it's kind of the club has been allowed to just rot on the vine, essentially. And once you fix that, and people will see that as fixed now, because those key appointments that they've promised to put in place are now in place, it's your job. It's on INEOS. And it's also on Ten Hag as well, right? It's also on Ten Hag because I feel like that, again, when Ratcliffe would point to the environment that Ten Hag was operating in as the reason for United's failure and for previous managers as well, that has now been fixed as well. And so this is, this next season is a bit of a petri dish, if you like, for us to experiment and to see whether Ten Hag is suited to this job. And so, yeah, it's you're right. I think no excuses is the perfect way to sum it up. From here on in, everything's in place for success. Obviously, it's going to take time. Obviously, there are other obstacles. There are financial issues that need to be overcome. I don't think anybody expects it to. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it's not just gonna work overnight. But really, falling back on the excuses of years of neglect or decline or whatever under the Glazer ownership isn't really going to wash anymore from this point onwards. And so that is kind of a bit of a watershed moment in Manchester United's history and Manchester United's future as well.
It's interesting. You mentioned two things there: petri dish. So that means it's going to be even more under a microscope. But you did also say, but it is going to take time. They haven't got time. As we said there are no excuses. This is like we've got the perfect setup. We're also making changes to the coaching staff. If there were any doubts in terms of the technical ability in what Erik Ten Hag previously had, we're going to be making changes there as well. Do you want to take us through those as well, Mark?
Yeah, so I think what we expect to happen, nothing's been absolutely confirmed yet, but we expect there to be additions to the coaching staff. I think it's been pretty well reported on The Athletic as well about Ruud van Nistelrooy coming back, the former Manchester United great. I think he's 11th in the all-time United goal scorers list, just outside the top 10 somehow. Doesn't feel right, but still, yeah. Obviously, he was the manager at PSV most recently. Had a successful first season there, finished second, won the Dutch Cup. Few fallings out in the end, with a few murmurs of tension between him and his staff and his players, which ultimately led him to leave. But a very highly rated young coach, and obviously with the United connection, that's going to go down well with fans. And I think people will assume, I don't know if this is always how it works, but people will assume he's going to probably get a song out of Rasmus Højlund and Marcus Rashford and other attacking players because of his own record. So we'll see if that works. There's René Hake as well, coming in as another assistant. He was at Go Ahead Eagles last season, which was Ten Hag's former club, led them to the highest finish since the 70s, I think it was, in European football. Highly rated coach. Actually somebody who Ten Hag previously headhunted while he was at FC 20. He used to come up against him when they were both kind of in charge of academies. I think Hake was at Emmen, and Ten Hag headhunted him and picked him in, and he's essentially done that again, almost 20 years later. This has been very much within Ten Hag's control, these changes to the staff, which is another sign, I think, that for all that we talk about, is this a sign? Is this a show of faith? Is there the trust there between him and INEOS? I think whereas INEOS felt that some changes to the coaching staff were necessary, Ten Hag's been allowed to have the influence over them. So there is still that level of trust, you can say, there. And we're also seeing a new goalkeeping coach come in Yellowton Rouloir. Now, with the exclusive story by our colleague Laurie Whitwell on The Athletic last night, he was goalkeeping coach at Burnley last season and had actually just agreed a deal to join Ajax, and now maybe in the process of coming to United, which seems a bit messy given the quick turnaround there. But those are the additions we expect. We've also seen, as we've reported a couple of weeks ago, Benny McCarthy's contract coming to an end. He's set to leave. And there's also been discussions about Mitchell van der Gaag, who is really Ten Hag's right man and assistant, about a potential exit for him. But there's nothing confirmed on that yet. Obviously, United are back in training on Monday, so you'd expect some things to to be finalised hopefully before then. We'll see whether that's the case. But yeah, I think those changes on the coaching staff, I think perhaps at the higher echelons of the club within the hierarchy, they felt some changes were necessary there if there wasn't going to be a change of management. And I guess Ten Hag still had influence over them, like I say, so we'll see whether it has the desired results.
Let's step away from the men's team for a moment. And I just wanted to talk to you, before we talk about, administrative staff and things like that. I wanted to talk about the women's team, Dan, if I can. And they've been asked to use temporary accommodation, porter cabins at the Carrington training ground due to some of the building work that's going to be going on. There's also been talk about them potentially having to train at St George's Park, which is not local to Manchester. What's your take on how and why this is happening to the women's team?
So I think if we start with the why they've done it, Adam, United, they're doing some upgrades at Carrington. They're going to be improving the men's first team facilities. They need to house those men's players somewhere, and they've decided to utilise the women's facilities, which have recently undergone their own upgrade. Now, by kicking the women out of there, the women are essentially now nomads, and are having to use temporary structures, to get ready or the rest of it. And then Charlotte Harper, our colleague, reported that there's a good chance they could be made to train at St George's Park, which I think is, it's not quite next door to Carrington. I think it's not a particularly good look for the club, especially when you consider the women won the FA Cup and then they cancelled their end of season due because of the men's performances had been pretty terrible. It just speaks to, the club will argue it's a necessary thing to do. They may say ultimately the men's team drives the revenue of this football club, which it is factual. However, the semantics, for their women's team, they're a good team, they're successful, they've just won, as I say, they won the FA Cup. They're now losing players. So Mary Earps decided to leave. She's gone to Paris Saint-Germain instead of signing a new contract. It is not, all is not right, I would say, with what's going on with the women's team at the moment. And this, moving them into temporary accommodation, perhaps maybe making them go and train at St. George's Park, just speaks to all of that too.
All is not right with the women's team, as you mentioned there. All is not right with around about 250 people as well, Dan. Adam Crafton reported that number of jobs is going to be cut in further cost-cutting decisions made by INEOS. Just take us sort of into that situation, into Old Trafford, where a lot of these people will be working, and what is the mood like at the moment, and the reaction within the club of this new era, which has led to a lot of people ultimately being made redundant.
Yeah, so Jean-Claude Blanc, the interim CEO, who is an INEOS figure, delivered the news earlier this week that 250 jobs are going to be cut. Now, this follows on from at the end of May, early June, United essentially put out voluntary redundancy offers to all kind of non-playing staff, so those based at Old Trafford, at the stadium. Old Trafford is the stadium, at Old Trafford, at Carrington, the training base, and the central London office. Now, I wrote about that at the time, and there was, I don't want to say hope, because that's not a particularly nice word, I think, when you're talking about people losing their jobs, but I think they thought there was going to be around 20% of people would sign up to that, because it would see them be paid their annual bonus, and coupled with Ratcliffe demanding all employers now return to the office rather than work from home, they thought, well, maybe 20% won't want to do that because their living conditions have changed or whatever else. However, the take up for that was pretty low. So now what we're seeing is nearly a quarter of their employees will be made redundant by the club. They're going through that consultation process now. Jean-Claude Blanc delivered that news. Now, I've spoken to people inside the room. They described it as somber, as solemn. I think, was it a surprise? I think this has been trailed for some time, and I think the club would probably say this has been trailed for some time, that these changes were coming. I don't think INEOS have made it a secret of the fact that they think that the workforce is bloated relative to recent success. United do have the largest workforce in the Premier League, but then I would also argue they are the biggest club still in the Premier League. I think it's been talked about in the media quite a lot, right? And we've certainly reported on it that they think the workforce is bloated. They probably will have to make cuts. So was it total surprise? No, I don't think so. However, is it still surprising to hear someone stand up and say there's a chance you're going to lose your job? I think when it becomes a reality, I think there is an element of surprise. And as I said, the meeting was described to me as very somber, very solemn. I think there were probably quite a few ashen faces, and it's not you wouldn't wish that on anyone. So it's not a nice time. No.
Let's end by talking back about what's happening on the field. Pre-season, as you mentioned earlier on, Critch, starts on Monday. Several players whose futures remain pretty unclear. That includes Mason Greenwood, Jadon Sancho, Casemiro. How much is there to sort out, and what are your expectations in this transfer window from now on in terms of the futures that are uncertain, those players that we've mentioned there?
There's a lot to sort out. You're right. I think it's a sort of legacy of the fact that everything that we've talked about, really, about this INEOS structure taking a while to come into place, for the uncertainty that there was over Ten Hag's future. I think that has all sort of fed into it. And multiple other things, PSR, finances, etc., etc. Greenwood is a big one. Not only because United returned to training on Monday, and obviously Greenwood wasn't training at Carrington with the rest of the squad. He hasn't been since January 2022, since his arrest, and look, that is a huge situation. I think there's been there's active live interest in him. We've reported on The Athletic about Marseille being one of the parties. There's others, Lazio, Napoli, Valencia as well. I think Marseille's interest at the moment is one of the more advanced ones. Our understanding is that is Greenwood's preference as it stands. Although, look, I think unless a deal can essentially be struck before the return to training on Monday, then the United are going to have to make a decision about whether Mason Greenwood is part of that party that comes back to Carrington. So there's a bit of intrigue there. Sancho, you mentioned as well. Obviously, no resolution to his argument with Ten Hag. Is there going to be a resolution to where he can play next season? Because he's one of United's top earners. He's in that bracket within the squad that is really at the upper echelon of wages. So who can really afford him? Who's going to be able to put that package together? I think from Sancho's perspective, the question is, can he really afford to spend any more time not playing, having had essentially 6 months on the sidelines where he's perfectly fit and able, but wasn't being selected and was exiled effectively? And then he's gone on loan to Borussia Dortmund, starred on the way to the Champions League final. There's a lot of talk about how that would increase his value and that United would be able to profit off that. But I think actually being able to generate that interest and ship him out because of those wages, because of the fees that United are looking for, I think that has actually proved quite difficult in the end. And yeah, but there's actually a lot of issues that are more regular. Those are two sort of disciplinary linked ones. But you've got players like Aaron Wan-Bissaka, Victor Lindelof, Christian Eriksen. These players are in the final year of their contract. Typically, for any club, when you reach that situation, you'd be looking to try and move these players on and perhaps get a fee for them before you lose them for free next summer. United have got decisions to make there because of the way that United do things and this weird kind of like +1. There's also other players like Maguire, McTominay, Ahmad as well. They're all in the final year of the contract, but they've got that +1. They've got that clause. So if there's a decision to make there, could you get a slightly higher fee without triggering the clause and move them on? It's a squad still that requires a lot of rebuilding and requires a lot of attention. It's still bloated in places. It's still perhaps not to the manager's requirements in places. There's players on huge wages that are going to be difficult to shift. There's a lot to still sort out. But I think now that Dan Ashworth's in place, now that Ten Hag's future is settled, now essentially that players are coming back and that PSR kind of soft deadline that we had isn't affecting other Premier League clubs anymore as well. I think you will start to see a bit more movement on those exits over the next couple of weeks, yeah.
Mark, Dan, thank you very much indeed. We will, of course, continue to analyse the situation at Manchester United in detail on The Athletic, also the moves in the transfer market as well. Really appreciate your insight as always. Thank you. Don't forget you can rate and review the podcast. Always appreciated here on the Athletic FC podcast. Post-match reaction to the quarterfinals at the Euros can be found on the Totally Football show. The daily football briefing as well reacts to it all in bite-sized fashion the morning after. We'll see you soon. Thanks very much for listening.
If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.